Hi, welcome to my PowerPoint presentation about progression in games and why Dark Souls and Persona upset me. So first off, let's start by answering what progression is. So probably the basest and most normal form of progression in a game is going to be its story. It's the characters and plot developing and doing shit. The story is pretty much the most easy, basic way a game will progress. When you play most games, they have a story that progresses, and it's just the start to ending. Now, there's another thing with the story is stories often mean that the progression, especially in adventure games, may be non-linear. You might have because of the whole hero's journey structure, there might be a slump at some point where you you don't have access to certain things. But most progression systems tend to be more linear, regardless of the game. The only example of a game where I can think of where the progression is or game genre, I should say, where progression is more inherently non-linear is roguelikes, where you lose everything and with because of permadeath, and so your progression is kind of a abstract thing. It's based off your skill and game knowledge that builds up over time. Whereas I don't know, traditional RPG, Persona, you level up over time. You just get new abilities as you level up, stuff like that, and that's probably the other form of progression system that's most easily recognizable. You're also gonna get pretty easy progression systems in Mario. The levels in that game. That levels tend to be the main way that games kind of use as a vehicle for progression, or it's the most standard way for games to use as a vehicle for progression, because having just a static number as or not a static number, but a number that changes as you progress along, it's a pretty easy way to denote, oh, you're better at the game than you were when you started. You started at level 1, now you're level 50 or whatever. It's a easy way to show, oh, you're getting better at the game, because you're usually, an RPG, your stats improve as you level up, and, that just, it makes the game, or it's an easy way to give a dopamine hit to your player as well as leveling up. So when you're designing a game, level systems are pretty basic. They're pretty common. Open world games tend to have less linear systems, and I included them because they have one of the worst progression systems as a staple of them in my mind, and that's crafting. Now, I think crafting in games, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it started as a popular thing in games because Minecraft was very successful, and a lot of games saw that and were like, oh yeah, this is an easy system of progression that makes it helps the game a lot. And also because a lot of other games started using crafting as its main vehicle for progression, but we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But the other main vehicle for progression is story in open world games. You'll see that in I don't know, Assassin's Creed games, where you have to look around the map and find things, go somewhere, do something, talk to some guy, and so that's kind of just a pretty basic part of progression. Another way is just gear and equipment. Gear and equipment is pretty much the standard form of progression in RPGs as well, besides leveling up. You might get a new sword or something, or you'll get a new piece of armor, and stats. Stats are associated with pretty much everything else, whether it's an RPG where you get stronger strength or you get better defense, all that stuff. They kind of just are how you measure progression at the end of the day. Now, why crafting sucks ass? So, crafting is tied to open world games pretty heavily. Cyberpunk is one of the more recent ones that comes to mind, but you see most Assassin's Creed games have it. Minecraft is another pretty big example. Red Dead Redemption 2. It's a staple of modern day open world games, and there's a reason for that. And it's because it creates a vehicle to drive players to explore. And what I mean by that is when you're out and exploring, if you don't have anything to look for that you're exploring to find, there's not much reason for you to explore outside of the sake of exploring, right? Now, in most games, the sake of exploring is part of the fun, but in a lot of games, it also kind of just adds some life to it. Like Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the examples of a crafting system in a game where it functions less as like a main vehicle of progression, right? But as a minor incentive for you to explore around the world, for you to look around the world, for you to engage in other systems around the open world that make it feel more alive, like whether that's hunting or fishing or whatever. And so it does have like a lot of merit as like a system of encouraging people to explore, but it's also overused and kind of oversaturated, which is part of the issue. And in some games like Cyberpunk, it doesn't actually really improve the game that much or give you much of a reason to explore. The thing with crafting systems is they don't tend to feel natural in a lot of games. I'm using Cyberpunk as an example, but because it's probably one of the most like shitty crafting systems in recent memory, in my opinion. But a lot of games will just have it be, oh, you find components of various rarities. And that just, it doesn't actually add much. It adds a different way for you to get items than just flat out buying them. That doesn't really make sense in the context of most characters who are actually buying them, or who would be like, crafting those items. Like if you're playing or if you're role-playing Cyberpunk as like a scientist or something, I guess. But like most games that they're in, Fallout's another great example. There's no real need for them at all. Like for the crafting system to exist, and they don't fit the context of the character. They don't really, improve the game. It just is a way for them to, add content and add kind of a grind. And this is what I dubbed this fetch quest syndrome, right? Where it kind of just leads to players who are looking to progress, just going out and Googling shit, like where shit is, and then finding the specific items they need, rather than them actually going out exploring and finding it naturally, which isn't a good, obviously, because it kind of removes the, incentive to explore if they're just gonna look up where it is and try and find it somewhere, And that's part of the reason why I didn't include, there's a couple games here which I have, on display as examples where there's kind of shitty crafting systems. Breath of the Wild is one of the only games I can think of where there's like a solid crafting system, and I'm not saying that just because I like Breath of the Wild is a good game, but more so because the crafting system in that game doesn't have like a recipe list. And I think that's one of the main issues with crafting systems in games is recipe lists kind of devalue crafting to a large extent. Part of Breath of the Wild, the crafting system in the game that I'm referring to, by the way, is cooking. So part of the reason why Breath of the Wild's crafting system works is because it's not exactly just like, oh, I have to go get a checklist of items, It's you scavenge stuff that you can find and then you cook it so that you get a single reward of varying quality based off of what you found. And in a lot of games, like Cyberpunk, again, as the example, but a lot of other games do this too. I don't know, Red Dead also kind of does this, but Red Dead's another example of it doing it a little bit better, but not much. When you have recipe lists, those turn more into fetch quests to get specific items that you want, especially when players are leaning towards higher ends of completion. So especially in the end game, it becomes a lot lower quality of an incentive to explore and more of a, how should I say, like reason to check things off a list, or a list to get things checked off of. It's not a real way to actually improve the player experience. It just kind of adds more bloat to the game, and it can honestly kind of devalue a lot of things. It can make items feel a bit more like grindy to get, and that's one of the other issues, is crafting kind of serves more as a grind in a lot of games than it does to actually like improve the quality of the game. It doesn't serve as much of a vehicle for exploration in a lot of games as it does kind of a pedestrian you have to get to on your vehicle to progress in a lot of games, which is why it's like it doesn't really work in a lot of games. And I'm speaking more in the open world context right now, but there's other games where it kind of sucks. Resident Evil Village is on screen right now because the issue is inventory management. Crafting kind of serves as a double-edged sword in terms of inventory management. So the issue with crafting as like game mechanic in games where you have inventory management as a like core mechanic is that it gives you an incentive to hoard, and then it also removes the consequence for hoarding. So it like the reason I say it's a double-edged sword is because for players who are collecting things and are actively crafting and using them, right? In like Resident Evil, for example, if you are actively collecting the items, like you're getting herbs and shit like that, ammo, things you need, or the materials to make them, right? That's taking up inventory space. And so the consequence for taking up inventory space is you can't get things you want. Otherwise, if that consequence doesn't exist, there's no real point of the inventory management system. There's no point of the inventory limit if it doesn't, make you make choices and make you have to take decisions of, oh, do I want to, have this gun, or do I want this healing item that might save me later, Crafting systems kind of devalue that a lot. And it doesn't actually, help the game in terms of making that inventory management system better. It kind of just takes away the critical thinking involved in inventory management to an extent, but it also rewards hoarding, which would, in theory, make inventory management worse. But when you can craft a lot of the things that, you want, then you're rewarded for hoarding by being able to craft more items. And if you can craft those items, or let's say, you can craft healing items, then you're incentivized to hoard the components to craft healing items, especially because they may take up less space, right? But the issue with that is if you're rewarded for hoarding, right, then there goes an incentive to hoard. But if you can craft it into the items you actually want, right, then there's kind of like a lack of disincentive to hoard. And there's how should I say, the actual disadvantage of not being able to get what you want because you were hoarding is reduced largely. And so the actual inventory management is a little bit less. It's not a make or break thing. It's probably the best way to describe it. It's more of it devalues a system which encourages critical thinking by rewarding the least thoughtful method of playing the game, which it's not on paper it sounds worse than it really is in practice, but it also is not something which is good. So you still want to avoid it. And that's kind of the thing at the end of the day. It creates a lack of reason for players to actually engage with the game's main systems and the way people actually are supposed to look at the game is through kind of a more desperate let's say Resident Evil, right? That's just the example I'm using for inventory management and inventory systems here, where you have limited inventory. But with Resident Evil, it's a horror game, right? And if you're hoarding things around in your briefcase and you have the ability to craft things that are let's say you can craft healing items, for example, right? It kind of disincentivizes the actual the desperation, or it doesn't disincentivize it. It dissipates the desperation of the situations you find yourself in, because you're stacked to the brim with stuff you can easily make into healing items, and you can heal up, and it creates a situation where a lot of the tension is broken up by a lack of difficulty and a lack of necessary decision making, which can, build up stress and build up the horror of the game. Now, the other thing is RPG crafting. Now, I have a very passionate hatred for how a lot of RPGs approach crafting. I think the main issue with crafting in RPGs is that a lot of the times it's completely useless as a game system. It's just done as an alternative to shops, and that's the other thing. That's kind of the issue with let's say Persona 5's crafting system. The workbench that you have there, right? It builds up a stat, it builds up proficiency, so there is on paper a usage for it, right? It's the ability to improve your proficiency, which is one of your social stats, over time. It is the ability to, progress your character by engaging in another system in the game. But the issue is the actual outcome of that system is almost entirely useless in most situations, and so it kind of is just one of those things that is a time filler, like when you're trying to pass time in the game, which isn't that bad, but also because of how plethorant resources are to the player, it kind of makes it seem like, why don't you just buy, I don't know, lockpicks at a shop or something like that? Like, a lot of the things that you're actually buying there are things that aren't super, like, they're either things that are necessary for the progression of the game, or they're kind of just like mediocre items that you don't really need. Like, lockpicks are the main thing where it's like it's very important to you as the player to get those and to actually have enough of those. But most of the items are just like, oh, do 150 damage of whatever, you know, it's do 150 fire damage or some shit like that, and it's not actually that impactful in terms of your minute to minute gameplay decision making, because of the fact that you have easy access to most forms of damage in any given palace at any given time, whether it's through, the party member you have who has access to that damage, or it's through, Joker, who's your main character who you have in your party at all times. And so there's kind of a uselessness to the crafting system for almost all of its items that is only justified by a specific few items that don't need to be locked in the crafting system. And so it kind of takes away from the game more than it adds, because it reduces the value of other places. Because, for example, if you had a shopkeeper, like, I don't know, let's say Y, the airsoft shop, he sold, he sold lockpicks. Then there's no more reason for the main, like, function of the crafting system, or the main importance of the crafting system, which is the lockpicks. Now, I personally have only played the game on, like, medium and a little bit on hard difficulty, right? So maybe I'm a little bit, like, maybe it, like, I don't know, maybe the special items which let you do 150 damage from throwing them in a turn are actually super, super duper useful on hard, like, the hardest difficulty or something. But it doesn't apply to most of the difficulties in the game, because they aren't, And lockpicks, on the other hand, they're necessary for the progression of the game, because to get the best items in most palaces, you need to lockpick chests. You need to find shit and lockpick them. Now, because lockpicks are a limited item, you might say, like, that adds to their value, and it makes the decision making when it comes to lockpicking chests harder. But I counter by just saying make them more expensive in a shop, like your character's a 17-year-old, maybe he has to pay more to get the lockpicks, or he has to meet someone to get lockpicks or something like that. So maybe it's the first palace's items would have been a new game plus thing, because you can lockpick those chests initially or something like that. There's better ways to go about it than to have lockpicks be like a central mechanic that is used in a system, in the game system, where the game system, like, that it's most used in is the most useless for the majority of the time you're playing. Also, this feeds into the next thing, because we're talking about Persona, and there is a very big issue with Persona's, like, progression, which I've noticed, and I think applies to other games as well. I'm not naming names, but there's a very specific one, and it's the ability to sequence break the actual progression of the game. I think sucks. I don't think games should really do that, because for one, it ruins the progression of the game. But if you're not playing Persona 5 Royal, right, if you're playing the original Persona 5, then you don't have access to these guys unless you pay for them. So I'm just going to add that the PTW thing on the slide, that's just because, there's specifically in the original Persona 5, it was pay to win, and there are a lot of games which have sequence breaking progression systems, which are functionally pay to win systems, and they're usually single player games. If it's an online game, I think that's different, because that's usually just like scamming or shit like that. Like, online games doing that's a whole other problem. But in single player games, it's very common in RPGs, in my opinion. The main ones I've seen are like, Because of Like a Dragon and Persona 5, where you have access to explicitly better items and equipment based entirely on you paying for them, which sucks. But in Persona 5 Royal, for example, because that game has all the DLCs, so it's not quite as bad, there's the issue of the actual sequence breaking. It ruins the progression of the game. The thing is, if you have the option to at any point basically get the strongest personas in the game, there's no reason not to. And that's kind of something I think of as viable deterrence by design versus like the optionality. I think things like that, if you should take them, there should be some sort of inherent reason not to do it. Like in Persona 5 Royal, for example, all of those personas are free the first time you get them. You can't get them repeatedly without paying a hefty chunk of change. Like I think it's like 90,000 yen when you get Messiah Picaro, for example. But he's like also got some of the strongest moves in the game. He has I think it's pronounced Megadolan, which means you do a shit ton of damage repeatedly in exchange for some health, which it's kind of balanced out because they have high costs, like they have endgame fixed costs. But because of the fact that you have access to them in the early game, and you still have the ability to use them repeatedly before you run out of the costs for those moves, like Megadolan, I think it's something like 60 or 70 HP, I don't know off the top of my head. And then the what's it called? The Almighty attack, that attacks all enemies and does severe almighty damage. That one is like 38 SP, which if you haven't played Persona 5, the physical attacks do HP damage to your character, and then you have SP, which is done magic attacks. It's fairly standard stuff. But the issue is the sequence breaks the game a lot because you have access to some of the strongest attacks and moves from the very fucking beginning of the game, if you so please, which doesn't actually, like, it's just a bad form of game design, in my opinion. And there is the fact that it's optional. You have to decide, I want to take Messiah Picaro as one of my personas. I think that's a good idea. And then if you take him early game, you realistically can't get rid of him without reacquire him later without like a very high cost, which is true, right? But by the point where you can get him back, it's really more like a mid-game thing, if you're being real. Like, by the time you're done with your first few palaces, you're going to be fairly fine with yen. You'll realistically be in like the hundreds of thousands at that point. It's not that bad. If you aren't like spending all of your money at the start of every palace, which you really don't need to do, like you'll be fine, right? Like the actual cost of him is very, very negligible compared to his power, and that's one of the issues. Is it's a complete sequence break of the difficulty of the game, and it does not help the progression. It's one of the worst things for progression, and there are other RPGs which do it. Because Like a Dragon is the other thing that comes to mind in terms of like having that as like a fundamental flaw with the game, where if you don't know, you can buy resources which give you the upgrades because Like a Dragon, and you can do that in Infinite Wealth as well. And I think that sucks. It shouldn't be in games. It ruins the progression, and it makes a lot of the actual difficulty that games have for specific systems completely just disappear. And it's a very poor way to design games. And from what I've seen, there hasn't been a game which has implemented it in a way where it doesn't actively harm the game's overall quality. Now, Dark Souls progression. I'd like to start out by saying this is not like an egregious issue. This issue isn't something that I hate, but it creates similar issues. It's similar issues of optimizing fun in the game. I forgot to talk about that with the Persona thing. So players generally have an inherent bias towards optimizing fun out of games. This is talked about usually in the context of like MMOs a little bit more, but it's kind of an issue in pretty much every type of game, like RPGs as well. RPGs are probably one of the bigger examples because, like, I mean, if you've ever played D&D and there's been that one guy who shows up with, like, a character who realistically can do, like, endgame damage because they use, like, a bunch of rules, lawyering loopholes and bullshit like that, it's just not as fun anymore when that stuff happens. And Dark Souls, it has a similar but lesser problem because, like, with Persona, for example, if you play the game optimally, you will take those personas when you can or when you want, and you'll just use them, You'll use the best personas in the game when you want because it helps you, and it's kind of just like an instant win button. But with Dark Souls, the issue is it kind of the progression in the game, right, is a crafting system. You go to the blacksmith. I think in Dark Souls 3 and 1, it's not Andre the Giant. It's not Andre the Giant. It's his name's Andre though. And you go to him and you craft your weapons stronger based off these little shards you get. Now, the thing is, realistically, this is not like a horrible progression system. It's functional, and it's more of an aside to the main game and the main progression system, which is Souls leveling up your stats, which also allow you to use new weapons. However, the issue is, or there's a couple main issues here, right? So, one is the optimizing fun out of the game. There isn't a Souls game which has done this, like, particularly well, in terms of, like, you being able to, there's no real Souls game in which you are locked out of progression at a point where you shouldn't be. And there is an argument to be made that isn't a bad thing for Souls games because their difficulty is so high, and the level of entry is a very high level of entry in terms of, like, difficulty. And so having a way for players to skirt around that by finding specific things or searching for specific things or searching for upgrades or grinding to be high enough levels is a good way to get players to naturally work around issues and problem solve. I don't think that's true in this case, however, because what it tends to do is it tends to take away two of the, like, okay, so the Dark Souls, like, gameplay loop, from my opinion, is the desperately searching around for the next boss and the fighting the boss and desperately overcoming the struggle, right? Like, the fun of Dark Souls comes from the challenge. I think that's a pretty, like, lukewarm take to say. And so, when you have the ability to curtail the difficulty of the boss by finding specific items, when a player learns of those specific items, one of the first things that's going to come to their head is say, oh, I should look for these items before I look for the boss. Now, you could argue that's not a bad thing. I would argue it kind of curtails a lot of the fun of Dark Souls, which is, again, the struggle to find the boss and fight the enemies and get around and progress through, very difficult odds. Fight these brutal enemies, and then you finally get to the boss, and it's more brutal, it's more tough, but then you overcome it. It's the dopamine rush of heroically overcoming impossible odds. That's the core fun of Dark Souls, right? When you have odds that aren't impossible, though, that takes a lot of that away. And that's kind of the reason why it's like Dark Souls games that are kind of like easier tend not to be very fun, at least in my opinion. A lot of the actual fun of Dark Souls games is not just like, it's the exploration being dangerous. That's part of the reason it's, fun to explore them. It's the, not trial and error necessarily, but it's, you have to be skeptical, and you have to be in fear. When you have the ability to step around that by, upgrading your weapons super easily, doesn't make it very fun, especially when you can upgrade them faster than you can actually, or faster than you naturally would progress. And that's the thing with Dark Souls and the weapon upgrading system, is upgrading systems, I think, should not be tied to resources like that, because if you can gather the resource before the actual point in which the resource is, in which the resource becomes, it breaks the barrier from being, an equalizer to something that overpowers the enemy, then that resource kind of breaks the balance of the game. And, it's not good, especially for a game like Dark Souls, where the whole fun of the game is the fact that it is imbalanced against you. And it creates, or it's a system where it's like, it serves as a good and functional system, but when the player begins to focus on it and focus on progression, it reduces the fun of the rest of the game. Like, if you've ever played Dark Souls, like your first time playing Dark Souls, right? It's so much more fun than every subsequent playthrough. And that isn't just because Dark Souls is like, It isn't because it's like a magical experience. It's not like, your first time playing, I don't know, Fallout New Vegas, and you're like wowed by the story and environment and all that. It's more of a thing where it's like you play through it, and then the fun is in the struggle. But once you've learned to overcome the struggle, the fun kind of dissipates over time, and that's why every new Dark Souls game is fun, because when you play when you go from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 3 to Elden Ring, right? When you play them in that order, the reason it's fun is because it's a ramping up challenge over time. The challenge still increases because you're still fighting new enemies with new mechanics. You're still fighting bosses with new patterns. They have different ways of fighting. There's, the differences with delays and all that, and it's a different way to play the game each time. And you also lose the progression of your characters across the games. And that's kind of the issue. It goes away in large part. The actual fun, the more you progress, which it leads to kind of a bell curve of fun, I've noticed, through this progression system of the resource-based progression system like this, where your most fun point is the mid-game. And by the time you're at the end game, it starts to get less fun again, because, you're too strong, Things are too easy. They're no longer a challenge. But the power fantasy is kind of all that's left, whereas the mid-game has both the power fantasy and the challenge, and the early game is primarily the challenge. There's some games which have a similar system to this. Minecraft is a very weird one to compare to this, but Minecraft has a similar thing where it's fun. The further along in Minecraft you get, when you're at netherite armor and all that shit, when you have elytras, the game stops becoming difficult in any way, really. Enemies are a nuisance. They're not something you you fight. Whereas when you have iron armor, for example, or diamond armor or whatever, a lot of the enemies in the game, they're still dangerous. They're just they're actually present. They serve a game design function, and then so there's actually a challenge, but you also have resources to overcome that challenge. Early game, you don't really have resources to overcome that challenge, but there is still a challenge, and it's the knowing to get to iron and all that. You want to progress. Dark Souls suffers from a similar curve of difficulty, where the challenge is there and the deprivation of resources is there at the beginning, but as you progress, when the deprivation of resources is no longer a very present thing, the challenge is pretty much gone. And that sucks. And I don't think Dark Souls suffers from it too extremely, but there are definitely games which also suffer from it, and it's something that I've noticed in a lot of games, specifically Souls-like games, where when they use resource-based progression systems, it kind of leads to that same bell curve of fun, where the most fun point of the game is the mid-game, and by the time you've beaten the game, the bosses are no longer that hard. You're no longer having as much fun overcoming them, and you're more committed to it because you just want to beat the hard game that you were struggling with for a while, rather than it because it was actually an inherently difficult game at the end, which sucks. And it makes me sad, and that's why it annoys me and upsets me. Anyways, this has been my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. I would really like to hear people's thoughts on this, so thank you for listening.